The CEO's forbidden love. The meeting. Evelyn Harper adjusted her glasses and smoothed down her pencil skirt as she stepped into the towering skyscraper of Sterling Enterprises. She had worked tirelessly for years to land this interview, and now, standing in the lobby of one of the most powerful companies in the city, she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, save for the soft hum of machinery. When the doors opened, Evelyn was greeted by a sleek, modern office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. At the center of it all was a large mahogany desk, behind which sat the man she had come to meet, Alexander Sterling. Alexander was the epitome of a domineering CEO. Tall, with sharp features, piercing blue eyes, and an air of authority that could make even the most confident person falter, he was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. As Evelyn approached, he looked up from his paperwork, his gaze cold and calculating. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You're late." Evelyn blinked, glancing at her watch. "I'm actually 5 minutes early, Mr. Sterling." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "In my world, early is on time, and on time is late. Don't let it happen again." Evelyn clenched her fists at her sides, forcing a polite smile. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. It won't happen again." The interview that followed was grueling. Alexander asked her tough questions, challenged her every answer, and seemed determined to find a flaw in her otherwise impeccable resume. But Evelyn held her ground, refusing to be intimidated by his domineering demeanor. By the end of the interview, Alexander leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You're not what I expected, Miss Harper." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Alexander's lips curved into a faint smirk. "We'll see. You start on Monday. Don't be late." The challenge. Evelyn's first week at Sterling Enterprises was a whirlwind. Alexander was a demanding boss, expecting nothing less than perfection from his employees. He pushed Evelyn to her limits, assigning her tasks that seemed impossible to complete in the given time frame. But Evelyn thrived under pressure, and she quickly proved herself to be an invaluable asset to the company. Despite her success, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander was watching her every move. His gaze lingered on her longer than necessary during meetings, and he always seemed to be nearby whenever she was working late. It was both unnerving and intriguing. One evening, as Evelyn was finishing up a report, Alexander appeared in the doorway of her office. "Working late again, Miss Harper?" Evelyn looked up, surprised to see him. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. I wanted to make sure this report was perfect before I left." Alexander stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. "You're dedicated. I like that." Evelyn felt a flush of warmth at his words, but she quickly pushed it aside. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I take my work seriously." Alexander walked around her desk, his eyes scanning the report she had been working on. "You've done well, but there's always room for improvement." Evelyn frowned, feeling a pang of frustration. "I've double-checked every detail. What more could you possibly want?" Alexander turned to face her, his gaze intense. "I want you to think bigger, Miss Harper. You have potential, but you're holding yourself back." Evelyn's heart raced as she met his gaze. "And how do you suggest I do that?" Alexander stepped closer, his voice low. "By not being afraid to take risks. By not being afraid of me." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel both vulnerable and empowered at the same time. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. Alexander's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Harper." As he left the room, Evelyn let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain: Alexander Sterling was unlike anyone she had ever met. Chapter 3. The tension over the next few weeks. The tension between Evelyn and Alexander grew. They were constantly at odds, challenging each other in ways that were both frustrating and exhilarating. But beneath the surface, there was an undeniable attraction that neither of them could ignore. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Evelyn found herself alone in the office with Alexander once again. She was exhausted, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. There was something about being near him that made her feel alive. Alexander approached her, his expression unreadable. "You're still here?" Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "I wanted to finish this project. It's important." Alexander studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Evelyn shrugged. "I'm just doing my job." Alexander stepped closer, his voice softening. "You're more than just an employee, Evelyn." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat at the sound of her name on his lips. She had never heard him speak so gently before. "What do you mean?" Alexander reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You know what I mean." Evelyn's breath hitched as she looked into his eyes. She could see the vulnerability there, the longing that he usually kept hidden. It was a side of him that no one else ever saw, and it made her feel special. But before she could respond, Alexander pulled away, his usual mask of indifference back in place. "Get some rest, Evelyn. You've earned it." As he walked away, Evelyn felt a pang of disappointment. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew that things between her and Alexander would never be the same. Chapter 4. The confession. The tension between Evelyn and Alexander continued to build, until one day, it finally reached its breaking point. They were in Alexander's office, going over a new project, when Evelyn suddenly snapped. "Why do you always do this?" Alexander looked up, surprised by her outburst. "Do what?" Evelyn stood up, her frustration boiling over. "Push me away. 1 minute, you're acting like you care, and the next, you're cold and distant. I can't keep up with you, Alexander." Alexander's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stood up and walked around his desk, stopping just inches away from her. "You think this is easy for me?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "You think I don't feel the same way you do?" Evelyn's heart raced as she looked up at him. "Then why do you keep pushing me away?" Alexander's expression softened, and for the first time, Evelyn saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I'm afraid, Evelyn. I'm afraid of what you make me feel. I'm afraid of losing control." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. Alexander wasn't pushing her away because he didn't care. He was pushing her away because he cared too much. Without thinking, Evelyn reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "You don't have to be afraid, Alexander. Not with me." For a moment, Alexander hesitated. But then, he leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was both passionate and tender. It was a kiss that spoke of all the emotions they had been holding back, and it left them both breathless. When they finally pulled away, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what I'm doing, Evelyn. But I know that I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "Then don't. Let's figure this out together." Alexander nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Together?"